Thank you, Terry. I actually realized as I was thinking about coming up here that I should probably explain Awaken works with churches, and it's one of our primary core beliefs about our conferences that we need to have lead pastor buy-in, that we need to have churches own the conversation. So it's been a real pleasure to get to know Terry and to see him take ownership of this and to be willing to sponsor this. We're grateful to EBC, Emmanuel Baptist Church, for hosting us today as well. So really, really good job, and thank you. Thank you for bringing this to Pullman. I think it's a real monumental thing you're doing. Okay, so I'm so glad to be here today. A few years ago, in the aftermath of a life experience that taught me what abuse was, I came to the strong conviction that awareness was key. I looked at all the possible things that I could do to make a difference, and it seemed to me, and it still seems to me today, that helping as many people as possible know how to recognize and respond to abuse is the most significant thing I can do. And that's why we invited you here, and why I'm so happy that you are here with us. So let's get started. First, let me say a word about awareness. Our goal is to achieve for abuse awareness what has been done for seatbelts and cigarettes. I like these examples because they're examples of a cultural norm that was changed by the increase in public awareness, that in turn changed opinion and brought about almost universal change in standard practices. And all of that happened within a relatively short period of time. And we need that with abuse. I also love the heart attack and stroke awareness examples as well, and they have a specific function because they really highlight the fact that we're really hoping at some level that each of you are going to be able to be early warning signs or even first responders if needed by gaining awareness. If we, like heart attack, if you know what the signs of a heart attack are, then you can help people before it's a crisis, before it's as bad as it would be when the EMTs show up. So that's another piece of the awareness puzzle. So what we want people to know is I want people to know what abuse looks like. I want them to know that it's not normal or okay. And I want them to have a pretty good idea of where to look for reliable help. So let's dig in. So what is abuse? I expect that all of us have some idea. Abuse is common enough in our cultural conversation, especially today, that we have some idea of what it means. Sometimes those views are poor, stereotypical oversimplifications, as I was when I used to think that abuse was more or less the man who gave his partner a black eye. Some people have a better, more well-rounded understanding of the dynamic of abusive relationships. But I think that when we are asked to put our finger on what makes the difference, what makes abuse different from other kinds of relationship dysfunctions, we can find ourselves somewhat at a loss. And I think that's because abuse likes to wear the camouflage of normal relationships with normal relationship problems. It can be hard to spot in the real world. So we're going to try to take a little bit of time and help make it easier for you to spot, especially by explaining the dynamic. Because I think once you understand the dynamic, then it will show up in places that are surprising. And that actually ends up being kind of exciting. I think you'll see what I mean by the time I get to the end here. So let's start by talking about the word abuse. I want to define and describe it, and then I want to compare it to what God says about the world. So first of all, we need to talk about the word itself. The word abuse, we have a complicated relationship with it. I have a complicated relationship with it. On the one hand, it is the handle or the word, the concept that helped me recognize the pattern that I was seeing in a friend's marriage, and it gave me access to all the insight and careful observations of experts who had been working on these kinds of problems for many years. That was really valuable. That abuse expertise is so valuable that I think we need to keep using the word abuse. Despite the issues, it's useful for that reason. But that brings you to the other shoe that's going to drop here. You can probably tell. Abuse has a lot of stigma attached to it. People resist calling what they're seeing in their relationship abuse. Men are very afraid of being labeled abusive. Using the word often immediately and completely puts people on the defensive, and that's a big challenge for us. And in the church, there's an extra layer of trouble because abuse is not in the Bible in the way that we use it in our culture. It's in the Bible a few times, but it really isn't used the same way. So that adds another layer to what can be a confusion as you try to help people understand what this is, especially in a church context. So what can I do? Here's what I've worked on. First of all, I keep judiciously using the word abuse. So I want to keep it in the conversation and connected to the resources in our culture, because I think that's so valuable. And so that people know what I'm talking about, so you can connect it to the bigger conversation. I also, however, try to soften and broaden the understanding of what we're talking about by incorporating some other words that also are good descriptors of the kind of relationship dysfunction that we're talking about. First, I really like the word destructive, because I think it's easier for individuals in relationships to see themselves as being destructive. The word destructive is something that people have less resistance to. Also, it's a good description of what's going on. It will use destructive is not the same as abuse, but I will use that word as to describe relationships that are on the coercive spectrum. Which brings us to coercion. That's another great word. This word is really a specific core aspect of abusive relationships. It helps us understand that one of the main things that distinguishes abuse is the forcing of compliance and the overpowering the will of others in a relationship. And finally, oppression is a great word, and it's one of the best Bible words to use to connect to abuse. In the Bible, God, as Terry already talked about, Bible, God hates oppression, and he judges oppressors. He delivers people from those who oppress, and he's a refuge for the vulnerable. So oppression is another word that we commonly use to flesh out the idea of abuse and connect it better to the biblical account. So the word abuse is important to us, but also problematic, but we have a working solution, and I hope that background will be helpful as we move forward and dig into this conversation. So let's talk about the word itself, abuse. One, the improper use of something, cruel and violent treatment of a person or animal. And I really like both pieces of that definition because the improper use of something is maybe the hidden part that we don't pay attention to as much. Abuse comes to our attention when we see something cruel or violent, and we're like, oh, that's abuse. But really, any improper use of relationship or of another person is abuse. And some of the lower level abusive behaviors will show up in that definition in a way that maybe will be surprising to you. One of the things that definitely happened to me when we started to study abuse was to see that, sulking or the cold shoulder are an abusive behavior and realize I do that was revealing. It was helpful to me to know that. And that's because that's the improper use of a relationship or a person. I'm not treating that person the way I ought to. But the cruel and violent part are important. Acute abuse is really where we're focusing our attention. And I also even love the fact that animal is in this definition because in terms of abusive behaviors, when they show up and they're larger than life, when they get your attention, sometimes they do take the form of somebody hurting or threatening an animal in order to get at a person. And it's very crooked. So one other thing that I would add is that for the most part today, we're going to be talking about patterns or relationships that are characterized by abuse. I've already alluded to this a little bit, but we all use things improperly sometimes, and I think most of us have been manipulative or snapped in frustration or sulked, given the cold shoulder, sometimes to get our way or to complain about something, which brings up this important distinction, and that's the distinction between a pattern or a behavior. So let me first say, behavior. Okay, we can go here first. Sorry, these are a little bit out of order. So all humans are liable to engage in behaviors. Once you have a pattern, that's the thing that's going to be problematic. You might find yourself with a pattern. It's generally progressive. With a behavior, it might be isolated and not a problem. So it comes down to what kind of a problem do you have. You shouldn't do the abusive behaviors either, but a single abusive behavior or an isolated abusive behavior is not as serious as a pattern. Can we go back to the other slide real quick? Yeah, thank you. So the range of behaviors, I wanted to say this too, is that there's a range of behaviors, and not everybody does all behaviors. So maybe a lot of people will sulk, right, or pout, whatever you want to call it. I didn't get my way, and now I'm going to show people I'm unhappy. That would be an abusive behavior. Angry swearing, I think fewer of us do that, especially swearing at somebody. And then when it comes to physical violence, I hope very few of us use physical violence when we're with other people. But that does show up. And so that's a behavior that's, in that cruel and violent part of the definition. And when you find that, it shows that there's probably an acute problem of some kind, even if it's only an isolated issue. Anyway, so since we're discussing patterns and patterns of behavior and not just the isolated behaviors, we're going to need more than just a definition. We're going to actually need to describe abuse. I think that's the way that you're going to see it and understand it better. So, going on to talk about healthy and normal. Before I describe the difference between healthy and abuse, I want to make a careful distinction between normal and healthy. Normal is what we're used to, what we assume because of the way that we were raised or because of the people who are around us. Oftentimes that normal is actually unhealthy in significant ways, but we just don't know it. Healthy is something that we sometimes forget to even look for. We look at our own experience, and if it's good, we assume it's healthy. Not good, I think we look around and find someone else who seems like they're doing pretty well, and then we call that normal, and we think of that as healthy. Essentially, this means that we define healthy not by understanding the purpose of our relationships or measuring meaningful results. Instead, I think we do a quick guesstimate about how many problems most people have and where we fit in the spectrum. Less problems means more normal. In reality, that can be very misleading because just like in our physical health, we're not all given the same constitution. We're not all given the same set of external factors. That smoker who eats fast food but still is able to do backflips, he probably shouldn't be your health role model, even though he's amazing, right? You know? So we have to make sure that we are comparing the right things. So the bottom line is healthy should be normal, and that's a good reason why we tend to associate the two, but that doesn't mean that they're always the same thing. Hopefully that all holds together. We will have a Q&A after if you have questions. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at some descriptive contrasts. Now these descriptions need to be seen in a big picture. Abuse unfolds over time and as a systematic pattern, so again, no one snapshot of a relationship will tell a complete story. So if a healthy relationship is made for mutual companionship, abuse prioritizes the emotional needs of one party at the expense of the other person. If a healthy relationship has room for ongoing disagreements or discussions as part of the differences between people, abuse insists on agreement with the truth of the abuser's point of view. If a healthy relationship would be for mutual encouragement and support, abuse is praise and comfort being more for one person in the relationship than the other. If a healthy relationship has a balance between existing family, friends, and your partner, abuse asks you to abandon all your existing relationships to, quote, be with him. If a healthy relationship is for learning, both parties learning from each other, abuse is one party always being forced to learn from the other. If a healthy relationship involves each party growing to appreciate the differences in the other, abuse is making the other into the likeness of myself, helping her learn what I like, learn to like what I like, and not taking the time to learn what she likes. If a healthy relationship empowers both parties through teamwork and a bigger world of connections and opportunities, abuse takes freedom, options, and power away from one party for the comfort and benefit of the other party. If a healthy marriage is a relationship for loyal, consistent, and mutual romantic affection and exclusive sex, abuse is disloyal, inconsistent, romantic affection, and a double standard in sex where she must be exclusive and I am allowed a porn habit, a mistress, or to sleep around. And here we come to the great tragedy of abuse. Relationships require vulnerability. If I know what you like and dislike, I can use that to hurt you. If you are what I like, you can hurt me. You can hurt me even more. I kind of switched my pronouns there. Pardon me on that one. If you use that power to hurt me so that you can get what you want or think you deserve, you are not only robbing me of what I justly expected in this relationship, mutuality, loyalty, and freedom, you are teaching me that the vulnerability that is required for healthy relationships is not safe. And the abuse begins to poison all of my relationships in that way. I'm going to just say that again. So the vulnerability that's required for healthy relationships is not safe. Once you experience abuse, you feel like, well, I can't. If I show somebody who I am and what I like and where I'm vulnerable, they're going to take advantage of that. And then that makes you not able to be in relationships the way you should be. So it's really ugly. So I'm a photographer. I love contrasts. I compose photos for contrasts in light and dark, contrasts in color, and even contrasts in subject matter. And then in post-processing, I even add more contrast. Contrasts are what make it possible for us to see things. Sometimes working on a landscape photograph, I'll go in and increase the contrast in a localized area to bring out the textures of the land and the way the light hits it. And that process can really make an image pop, as we say in the photo world. So I want to see what kinds of things stand out from the contrast that we just drew above. What pops in the contrast between abuse and healthy? First, abuse is parasitic. Abuse acknowledges and feeds the needs and desires of one party at the cost to the other. There's a power imbalance. Abuse takes away the personhood and personal power of the other. In a healthy relationship, each party gets help and growth from the teamwork that is part of a good relationship. In the world of each partner is bigger because they are together. In an abusive relationship, the abuser grows, but he grows like a tick filled with blood of its host. He's not really bigger or more capable or more powerful in the bigger world. The second thing that pops out to me is that abuse removes power by silencing the voice of the other person. Praise and encouragement go one way, criticism goes the other way. The voice of the other is limited or even removed. There is usually a double standard, and that is protected by silence and secrecy. There's usually an enforced secrecy. The duty of protecting the reputation is often one of the abuser's favorite topics, especially when he's misbehaving. One of the most important manifestations of personhood is voice, and abuse takes away that voice. The two things that I especially want to focus on are voice and person. If you only take one thing away from this talk, I hope it will be this. Abuse removes or degrades the other person, restricting their voice, restricting their power or agency. And one of the main ways it does that is by removing the voice of the other. So it's voice and person. We see this tendency arising in ourselves even sometimes, and I think it often shows up when we're in an argument or a conflict with another person or a group of people. Think of group of people, I think of the political party that you think is crazy, right? You think that all of their solutions are bad. Maybe we're not that political. If so, congratulations to you. I'm glad that you're in that category. But it's easy for us to do when we see the person over there making that crazy argument and we want to relegate them to crazy. See, I did that. I turned them into not a person by calling them crazy. Now I don't have to listen to what they have to say. Ridicule is a common way to remove the voice of the other person. We stop seeing another person as someone who has legitimate experiences or an important concern, and we welcome name-calling and stereotyping. There are other methods of discrediting the humanity and personhood of the person who disagrees with us. The fight for the person and voice of the other is not just out there, it's actually right here with us, it's close to us, and it's something that we deal with every day on social media, right? So those contrasts between healthy and abuse show us that abusers remove or restrict voice and person, and they give us an understanding of something else too. They actually show us what healthy is, and here's where I think it really gets good. When I looked at the face, when I looked abuse in the face and recognized what it was doing, I learned some things about healthy. In the high contrast moments, when you are facing the trauma of abuse, you can see things that didn't stand out before. In my life, it took me seeing someone systematically taking away the voice and agency of another person to realize that healthy is the opposite of that. And from those moments of clarity comes an awareness that makes me passionate about empowering and giving voice to those around me. I don't always succeed. Sometimes I forget and fall into coercive attitudes or behaviors. But seeing what I've seen has given me awareness, and that means I recognize those attitudes and stand up to them. And I also make positive efforts to use my voice on behalf of others and to honor and empower people. So finally, what does God say about this? Oh, we have a slide here. Yeah. Healthy, abusive, person is diminished or empowered, the voice is restricted or removed, or it's honored and heard. I think that's pretty straightforward. Let's talk about what God says about abuse. We're in a church after all. How does this fit in with who God is? What does he say about people and voices? To me, this is where the rubber meets the road. I don't have time to go through a thorough study. Obviously, we're almost to the end of this talk. But let's just take our example of God's intentions by looking at what he did at the beginning. It seems like a good place to figure out what he wants to do. In the beginning, God created a man, Adam, in his own image, a living person. God made Adam in his image, and the first job that he gave Adam was to use his voice and to name the animals. I think God was teaching us that our voice matters. Abuse is the opposite of our God. He makes people and gives them an important voice. Abuse reduces and removes the person and restricts and removes their voice. And he didn't just make a world and stand back and watch from afar. He entered into our story. He interacts with us routinely and continues to show us how much we matter. If the eternal God, creator of the universe, says we matter, how can we say anything else? God's word on this is clear. Persons are very important, and they are to be cherished, honored, empowered, and their voices matter. He wants us to pray. He wants to enter into conversations with us. That's a surprising thing, isn't it? If God wants to talk to me, to hear from me, I should be willing to hear my neighbor. We want to give voice. And when we despise the voice of others and take away their personhood, we are dishonoring him and his purpose. And that's not what we're for. That's abuse. And we need to stand up to that in ourselves, and we need to stand up to it in others. God loves the world. He sees us and loves us. More than that, God hears us. Our voices matter to him. In that context, how can we not be passionate about seeing the other and being happy to hear them? So this is why I wanted to talk to you about what abuse is. I'm passionate about both what it teaches us to stand against and what it has taught me to stand for. When I saw a voice and a person being systematically taken away, it put a fire in me to stand against that. And that is not just out there. Its potential is present in each of us. That is what I hope this day will bring to many of you. I hope that you will see a picture of the ugliness of abuse that creates a contrast. I hope that that contrast will show you not just what to stand for, but what to stand against, but what to stand for. And I hope you will see the other person and honor them because God has created them. And I hope that you will hear their voice because that voice of the other speaking to you is God's gift to you, not just when they agree with you, but all the time. Thank you. So we're going to have questions. You can text questions, I should have mentioned this earlier, to this number up here if you have any questions. And we'll answer them here. And if you have questions for Terry from his talk, you can do that too, although there will be a panel discussion later on too for us to answer any questions that we don't catch. We can share them with you as a document, I'm sure. Yeah, that would probably be the easier thing for us to do. Okay, here's a question. Is your healthy versus abuse contrast chart available online somewhere? No, I don't think it is, but I could make it available to you. Actually, I think what you should do is, if you want some of the materials that we've talked about here, feel free to email us at awakenidaho@gmail.com. Or you can text this message too, actually. That would be fine. Just send an email so we can send it to you. That would be the good way to do that. Sorry, okay. How do you respond to someone arguing with your concern about abuse when they rely on the concept of normal? If they are focused on something being normal so that it can't be abusive, is there a way to move the conversation forward? Okay, let me see if I can summarize this down. Someone who's arguing. Okay, so they don't think it's abuse because they think it's normal. I think that's what's being asked here. So I think that the conversation can move forward primarily when you can focus on some specific thing. In this context, when somebody's trying to say, hey, what we're doing is normal, I really think that it's an interesting challenge that you have when you're dealing with abuse, because we're looking at a pattern to see what the big picture is. To really identify, hey, this is an abusive situation or relationship, you need to see the big pattern. But in order to be able to identify that pattern, you actually need to focus on specific behaviors. And so I think the way that I think I understand the question, and I'm going to try to answer it from where I think I understand it. I think what you need to do in a situation like this is you need to look for specific behaviors that you can point to, and we've done this before. We've been in this situation before where somebody's saying, I don't know what this is. It's hard to see. It is hard to see it sometimes. What are the behaviors you're seeing? And how many of them are you seeing? Identify specifics and talk about the specifics and say, like, is that really okay? Is it, is this what we're supposed to be doing? And you don't have to convince somebody, this is another thing I would say, is you don't have to convince somebody that a situation is abusive. You can just say, hey, is it destructive? That's one of the nice things about the word destructive, actually, is this making you better? Is it making them better? Ask that question. Is this interaction in the relationship building either of you up? Or if it's not, then maybe we can call it destructive at least. Maybe we can agree that there's a better way to do it. And so I think that might be a way forward as well. So instead of getting stuck on, hey, this isn't healthy, say, well, is it destructive? There's the opposite side of that. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is good, actually. Thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca is helping from the crowd over here. What she's saying is that, and this is absolutely true, when you're close to a situation, it's harder to see. So if you can get an example of somebody outside of you to look at, to say, hey, I see that behavior over there. If you identify the behavior in somebody else or some other situation, even if it's a story like a movie, or it can come from all different kinds of places. When you can see the example outside of yourself, identify it and analyze it there, then you can bring it back into your own relationship and compare it to what's going on in your own relationship or in the person that's close to you, and maybe see it better. So that's a good tip as well. I think we want to try to ask questions through here. So feel free to text a question if you've got a question, and we'll try to get it up here. So what if you have been taught by the church that conforming to your husband's likes, dislikes, opinions, etc. is the way to be a good wife? Doing otherwise would be selfish. If your husband believes the same thing, he would not be abusing, but would accept and expect that submission. Okay, so this is something we are going to talk about throughout the day. The church's teaching on submission and can often be very problematic, especially and this, when I went through that descriptive contrast, I'll tell you that I did some of those things. Right, I was raised with this kind of an expectation, and I thought, this is what I'm supposed to do. Right, I'm supposed to help her know what I like, and not so. I think this is a bad idea. But like Terry was talking about in his talk, patience is a big part of what we have to do here. So I think you have to just be consistent in saying, look, you have, and here's the wonderful thing is, I think a lot of times when people are fighting, they get in a tug of war, and they won't let go. And if you're in a tug of war situation, one of the first things you need to do is figure out how to let go. And that's even if you're in a situation where somebody is oppressing you. It doesn't help to tug of war with him. So you can acknowledge that he has an important perspective. Your perspective matters, but so does mine, okay? And sometimes when people are fighting for, like, you have to listen to me, they really do just want to oppress you. Maybe that's what's going on. That could be. But it could also be that they want to be acknowledged as having an important perspective. And when you're in the tug of war, it's not safe to say, hey, you have an important perspective. But I think you can even there say, you have an important perspective, as long as you say, and so do I, right? So let me recap that, because I think I said that in a little bit of a confusing manner. Here's what I'm saying. It doesn't feel safe in a tug of war to give any credit to the other perspective. You almost know, if I say this, he's going to say the opposite. And so or she's going to say the opposite, and you're constantly pulling opposite directions, right? So it feels like you can't let go. And I'm saying that a really good technique to potentially let go, to let the tension off that rope, is to say, what you say matters, and I'm listening, and I care about what you think, but I also need to see that you care about what I think, because my perspective matters too. Okay? I think that's all I have to say about that. We'll talk about it more. Last question? Oh, for time. Okay, last question then. What do you think is the most misunderstood type of abuse, and why? Misunderstood type of abuse. Wow. It's a tricky one. I think spiritual abuse can be really tricky. I'm gonna actually target that one. We're in a church, so it makes sense to talk about that. So spiritual abuse can show up with a very subtle kind of cruelty and with almost no violence, at least in any kind of way that we would recognize as violence. And it shows up, I think, primarily in guilt and shame. It shows up primarily in, I thought better of you. Don't you want to please God? Don't you want to serve God and do what He wants? I think we're disappointing God. I thought, I never thought you would do this. Things like that, and then it can also be layered in with. It's really interesting. Intention matters quite a lot, and so somebody who's acting righteously, they're practicing their faith in a really exemplary way. They might be doing it at the same time they're telling somebody that they're not enough, and the very practice of their faith is actually an abusive behavior, because they're deliberately showing people how insufficient they are. I think, in fact, that's a lot of what Jesus is addressing in the Pharisees. The way their extravagant righteousness wasn't really about empowering people. It was about maintaining their superiority. It was about keeping people down and making others recognize how great they were. It was really about puffing them up. So I think that's what I would answer. I mean, that's a tough one. That's a good question. I will think about that and see, maybe there's something else. Maybe we can come back to it in the panel discussion. Thank you very much. We're going to take a 10-minute break now, I think, and we'll come back.